just know, like, you're gonna have to forgive some things. You'll see, like, some, like, maybe tape on the walls and, like, music that's gonna, you know, the score is not done, things that'll, like, you know, tweak and change. But by and large, it's the movie you'll see. But please go see it again August 9th, because it'll be even better. And we're nervous for you to see it today, but also just so excited, because I feel like I can trust that you guys know that it's not totally done, but you'll still really love it, and we hope you do.
Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. So, Blake Lively has recently been called a liar in federal court. Yes, that's right. She's been accused of lying and trying to hide behind laws, all while attempting to avoid responsibility and punitive damages by denying a business the right to take their complaints and grievances to court. And this, my friends, is actually a protected right under the U.S. Constitution. According to Baldoni Friedman and their team, they argue that they have a First Amendment right to seek legal redress. There's this doctrine used in court, a Thibault precedent, that says as long as a lawsuit isn't frivolous and is filed with the intent to seek damages from the individual or company, even if it harms them, they cannot be penalized. The only time you can be penalized is if the lawsuit is deemed frivolous. In this case, they argue that you can't judge the merits of a case during a motion to dismiss, which is meant to determine whether the complaint fits within the law. Blake Lively's contract also came up, and the breach of that contract was mentioned as part of the case. There's a lot to unpack in this motion to dismiss, and while I'm not a lawyer and can't give legal advice, I do want to highlight that they're using the Noor-Pennington doctrine. This is an established law that clearly states it prevents liability for exercising rights protected by the Petition Clause of the First Amendment. Basically, the First Amendment guarantees the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, like filing legal claims in federal court. Federal law and civil procedure rules hold precedence over state laws, meaning that if there's a conflict, the federal law will override state law. They're making a solid point here, and it's a compelling legal argument. But beyond that, I want to focus on something a bit different. One of the key points that Blake Lively is trying to argue here is that she has every right to bring forward these claims. She believes she has the right to speak out against harassment, and that right is protected under the law. She's attempting to use litigation privilege to defend herself, but the other side is pushing back, arguing that Lively herself made defamatory statements. The statements she claims were defamatory are not what they are referring to, however. Lively had tried to say that the statute of limitations was up when she first brought her allegations to Wayfair back in May 2023, but they're not buying that argument. They're saying, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're focusing on when you went to the New York Times and the period during the promotion of the project. We're talking about that very specific and narrow time frame when you and your husband, along with your PR team, were out there making these claims, calling us sexual predators. It gets even more interesting when they dive into the timeline for the defamation claims. They point out that Lively incorrectly argues the defamation claims stemmed from the 17-point list she gave to Wayfair back in November 2023. That's not the case, though. While some of Wayfair's claims do relate to that list, the defamation actually comes from statements Lively made between July and December of 2024. That's the critical window they're focusing on. The part about malice is also really telling. In their response to her claims, they tear apart her defense, which relies on Section 47.1, a protection she would typically get for reporting sexual harassment under California law. But here's the catch. She can only get that protection if her claims were made without malice, and if there's a reasonable basis, in fact. That's where they argue Lively's case completely falls apart. According to them, Lively fabricated her harassment. Claims either entirely or exaggerated minor, harmless interactions in a deliberate and malicious attempt to take control of the film. Not only that, but they argue she made these claims to restore her reputation after a very public series of marketing blunders that damaged her image. A lot of the arguments I've been making and the speculations I've had about what they were saying in their motions are actually mirrored in what they argue here. Remember how I mentioned that Blake Lively was using harassment claims to gain creative control? Well, they directly address this as part of the subsequent negotiations. Lively was granted an executive producer title, which is a ceremonial role typically given to talented individuals like her. However, Wayfair and Sony refused to give her a true producer credit because such a title didn't reflect the actual role she played. They didn't require Lively to contribute to the film beyond her role as an actress and executive producer. While at the start of production, it seemed like they would have a positive and collaborative partnership, Lively had other plans. They also reference a Forbes interview where she openly admits that she needs to feel like she has authorship to be fulfilled. This was not something she shared with Wayfair or Sony at the time, but it's a sentiment that, according to them, caused some serious issues. Producers and directors often see this kind of behavior as a rug pull, especially since they hired Lively to be an actress. And that's exactly what they argue she did. They claim that Lively's constant interference disrupted the production, leading to unnecessary stress, chaos, and delays. To drive home their point that Lively only brought up these sexual harassment claims in an effort to gain more control, they highlight a specific moment. They say that once the strike ended, out of nowhere, she blindsided them with a 17-point agreement of non-negotiable conditions. The purpose, they argue, was to insinuate that Baldwin Heath and others had engaged in sexually inappropriate conduct during filming, but they firmly deny this. Wayfair and Sony tried to amend the document to make it more factually accurate, but her legal team responded by saying the list wasn't up for negotiation. They were left with no choice but to sign the document as it was, even though it was factually incorrect and implied serious misconduct, or else they would lose millions of dollars and possibly cost hundreds of people their jobs. After they had been out of work for months, this situation threatened to destroy their relationship with Sony. Despite the insinuations, the demands themselves were actually agreeable because they had already been in place. But regardless, Blake Lively used this situation to extort the Wayfair parties into granting her editing rights, allowing her to create her own version of the film. She also demanded to remove Baldoni from all marketing and promotional materials and insisted on having Wayfair sponsor her for a PGA mark. The Wayfair parties characterized this as clear extortion in real time. Do you remember that letter Mr. Heath sent to Wayfair, basically stating that, without going into details, they were being extorted by Blake? She was holding threats over their heads, and that's exactly why I said they're accusing her of extortion. Blake argued that they only brought up this extortion claim now, but they're standing firm in saying, no, we pointed this out at the time. This situation even led to Baldoni being excluded from the premiere, among other ruthless demands. Blake reportedly said that to the extent Wayfair agreed to her demands, they did so under extreme pressure, essentially staring down the barrel of a gun. In their filing, the parties dismantled the insinuations in the 17-point list, going point, by point over a total of 391 pages, including Exhibit A. They claim Lively fabricated, mischaracterized, or grossly exaggerated the allegations in her CRD complaint and federal lawsuit. In their eyes, Lively is lying, and they're not backing down from this. Interestingly, in cases like this, when you file a motion to dismiss, your lawyer often asks you to file a declaration, much like we saw with Jed Wallace. He stated under oath and under penalty of perjury that Lively's accusations were false. If Jed Wallace lied in that declaration, and they could prove it, he would face sanctions. On the other hand, when Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively filed their motions to dismiss, neither of them provided declarations under oath or penalty of perjury. That, to me, speaks volumes. From my experience with motions to dismiss, I've always had to file a declaration under penalty of perjury, and that's standard when you're innocent. Now, here's where it gets more intense. Lively falsely claimed that there was no intimacy coordinator on set, even though she knew one had been hired 6 weeks before filming started. Yet, she refused to meet with the coordinator during pre-production, forcing Baldwin to personally relay the coordinator's suggestions about the scene's mechanics. Lively falsely claimed that certain Wayfair parties insisted on being around her while she was undressed or breastfeeding. In reality, Lively openly breastfed on set, and no one ever entered her guarded trailer without prior permission. She had a security guard stationed outside her trailer at all times. The FAC includes a text message from Lively to Baldwin, inviting her to her trailer while pumping breast milk. And this was after the events she claims involved harassment. Lively also falsely claimed she was forced to be nearly naked during the filming of a birthing scene. However, she was actually wearing black briefs, a hospital gown, and a pregnancy suit, with only her legs visible. Lively also falsely claimed that Wayfair hired a random friend of Baldoni's to play a gynecologist, but in fact, the actor was a Shakespeare-trained professional with an MFA in acting from UCLA. She also claimed that she was shown porn by Jaimeo. Heath, but in reality, in relation to the birthing scene, Lively was shown a single non-pornographic clip from the video of Heath's own son's home birth. Lively falsely claimed that Baldoni harassed her during the filming of a purportedly soundless slow dancing scene, an allegation that was definitively disproven by raw footage with sound that Lively apparently didn't realize existed. Lively also falsely claimed that Baldoni fat-shamed her, when in fact, he privately inquired with her personal trainer about her weight to prepare for a lifting scene, considering his long history of back problems. Lively further claimed there was no such scene, but the relevant portion of the script is included in the first amended complaint. She also falsely claimed that Baldoni admitted to committing sexual assault, when in fact, he disclosed that he had been the victim of sexual assault himself. These claims that he was a predator because of some boundary-crossing incident where she said it made him reevaluate are being completely denied. The legal team says these are just a few examples and don't even come close to covering the full scope of her lies. They stated in the strongest terms that the accusations Lively made concerning sexual harassment and retaliation are entirely false, and that she knew they were false from the start. Lively acted with malice and made these accusations without any reasonable basis in fact, they argue. They also emphasize that this isn't a decision to be made in a motion to dismiss. It's actually a fact that needs to be determined in court. I believe they're absolutely right on that. Furthermore, they argue that the 47.1 protection would not apply to Sloan's or Reynolds on Lively's behalf because they're third-party communications, making it an important distinction to consider. They don't have protections for her, so they're calling her out for lying to try and prove malice, right? They argue that she knew exactly what she was doing, and were even bringing up points I mentioned last week, like how she didn't have these claims investigated by the proper authorities. In this complaint, they make it clear that she filed her CRD, Civil Rights Department complaint, but she never intended for the CRD to actually investigate the allegations. Instead, she let it sit for weeks before finally filing a lawsuit. Technically, she had up to a year to file, but typically, when someone receives the right to sue, they file their lawsuit on the same day. In this case, they say she didn't file it immediately. She didn't ask for an investigation into her claims. In fact, she waived it entirely. She didn't report the harassment to HR either. She didn't take any real steps to have the situation investigated to verify whether it was truly sexual harassment. The arguments they're using are all designed to prove malice. They point out factors like her failure to investigate, her visible anger and hostility, and reliance on unreliable or biased sources. All of these lead to the inference that Lively had serious doubts about the truth of her own statements, because if she truly believed the harassment happened, she would have allowed an official investigation. She would have let the CRD or EEOC look into it, or at least made a formal complaint to HR, where the appropriate investigations could have been conducted. Malice is often inferred when the defendant fabricates their story, or when the claims are based on unverified information or imagination. They argue that Lively's motives for making the statements were clear. She wanted to harm the Wayfair parties. They also point out that Lively clearly knew the allegations were false at the time she made them. She was describing her own alleged experiences in her complaints, as thoroughly outlined in the FAC, but she wasn't actually sexually harassed on the set. Instead, they claim she grossly mischaracterized or outright fabricated the events. Even in sworn legal documents, Lively and her co-conspirators are said to have engaged in a coordinated campaign to exaggerate benign interactions and push a completely false narrative. They claim that Blake Lively used the sexual harassment allegations to instill fear in the Wayfair parties and leverage it to gain power. The whole point of these allegations, they argue, was for her to take control of the film. If you know anything about Hollywood, you shouldn't be disillusioned. Extortion like this happens all the time. Both women and men use false allegations as leverage to get what they want. So, the idea that the Me Too movement is somehow dead because of Blake Lively is ridiculous. Sure, there are people who have truly been harassed and victimized on sets, but there are also people who weaponize these claims to their advantage. Wayfair believes Lively is in the latter group, using the allegations as a tool to gain power. They argue she succeeded, pointing to the document she forced them to sign that granted her editing control, giving her the chance to extort them further. This gave her the power to threaten to withhold involvement from promotions and secure a deal with Sony. I'm glad they brought this up because I found the letter Jaime wrote about the extortion back in June, which proves this wasn't a new claim. On page 23 of the complaint, they state that Lively first obtained a producer credit and then a coveted PGA mark by coercing and threatening the Wayfair parties. She manipulated them into giving her the credit and writing a letter of support for the mark, an act Jaime openly recognized at the time as extortion. These allegations alone are enough to defeat her motion to dismiss the claim for civil extortion. They argue that she extorted them to secure the PGA credit, which, as many of you pointed out in the comments, is exactly what happened. She got that PGA credit. That's what they're saying too. Towards the end of their argument, they state that Lively further claims she didn't engage in extortion because she didn't obtain anything of value from them through threats. However, as they point out, that's not true. She threatened her way into the valuable producer credit and PGA mark. Even if that weren't the case, extortion can still apply even if the defendant didn't obtain money or property through threats. They have sufficient facts to state a claim for civil extortion based on at least the demand that Reynolds and Lively issue a self-destructive statement. If they didn't take responsibility for Lively's press troubles, she'd attack Wayfair in the press. The complaint alleges that Lively demanded consideration, and if they didn't comply, she would threaten to destroy their business. While I'm not sure what will happen with the extortion claim, the arguments they've presented here are pretty solid. When it comes to the breach of contract issues, Lively argued they failed to state a claim, much like how Ryan Reynolds said, "You didn't identify what exactly I did or said." She used the same defense. They also note that she argues, quite confidently, that she didn't fail to cooperate with the parties. However, Wayfair's team can and will amend to add more specifics if needed. Now, here's how they argue Lively actually violated her contract. It required that her right to consult and approve certain aspects of the film's production and marketing be exercised reasonably, not in a way that would frustrate Wayfair's ability to fully and timely develop, produce, or exploit the film. The contract also stated that Lively couldn't terminate her performance except in very narrow, inapplicable circumstances. Yet, as they allege in the complaint, this is exactly what happened. She repeatedly threatened to terminate her performance, both in acting and promotional services, claiming she wouldn't do anything that would interfere with Wayfair's rights. Lively's claims that she didn't frustrate any specific contractual provisions are dismissed as frivolous. The contract clearly stated that she could provide input on production and marketing, but she couldn't use that right unreasonably. This meant she couldn't delay the film's release, increase costs, or obstruct Wayfair from utilizing the rights they'd paid for, such as her acting likeness or promotional efforts. She was only allowed to quit under very specific circumstances, and the response claims she didn't meet those. Despite this, she continued threatening to quit repeatedly, promising not to interfere but failing to uphold that promise. Her behavior, they argue, directly interfered with their ability to finish and market the film, which would be a breach of her contract. Essentially, they claim that she was obstructive, unreasonable, and caused them financial harm. What's important here is that their response to her motion to dismiss is far more solid than Blake's response to Jed Wallace. Instead of wasting pages revisiting facts like Blake did, they directly address the first amended complaint, arguing against her claims. That's how these responses are supposed to be, clear and straightforward. In this case, they present some very strong arguments, and it's hard to imagine this getting thrown out. Over and over, they show how many of her arguments are either frivolous or about things that the judge can't rule on because they're not legal matters. It's a matter of fact, and that can only be determined once they go through discovery, or proceed to summary judgment, or even involve a jury. At this point, it's hard to imagine her case getting thrown out. Brian Friedman, in a statement to TMZ, made it clear, "Miss Lively and her group of Hollywood elites cannot prevent my clients from exercising their constitutional right to petition the court and clear their names from her false and damaging claims." He went on to explain that what Lively is trying to do is set a dangerous precedent by blocking access to the court system, punishing his clients for seeking justice, a right protected by the First Amendment. This isn't just about Mr. Baldoni and the Wayfair parties in this case. It's about all Americans who might one day face false accusations and seek relief through our legal system. Friedman continued, "This must stop here. We will keep fighting against this blatant attempt to block access to the courts and to weaken our nation's constitution to protect those who hold power." Naturally, Blake couldn't let them have the last word, so her lawyers fired back. They said, "That's right, Justin Baldoni. The man who has built his career supposedly speaking up for victims believes that the First Amendment rights of sexual assault and harassment victims to speak out should be overridden by the rights of perpetrators to sue their victims into oblivion. They added that Brian is so obsessed with destroying Blake and undermining her credibility. He has lost sight of justice. They're trying to twist the law, which was created to protect victims, into something that will send a chilling message to others, discouraging them from speaking out. Naturally, Brian Friedman responded, saying, "This convoluted statement makes it abundantly clear that Miss Lively and her team are rattled. Once again, they're resorting to inflammatory remarks to deflect from the actual facts. It's clear they want to distract the public from the real evidence, the receipts, the actual documents, the video footage, and other undeniable proof that irrefutably shows there was no sexual harassment involved," he continued. It's also surprising that Miss Lively and her team are suddenly so passionate about defending the hard-earned rights of the survivor community, especially considering she ignored this topic entirely during the film's promotional campaign. Instead, she focused solely on her own hair care and alcohol products, which was a major factor in the organic backlash she received. He added, "She doesn't need Discovery to figure out who's been smearing her. Just a mirror. Will do." Oh, I'm so glad he said that. It's rich that she's speaking up for victims now, especially when she chose not to during the promotion, which caused all that backlash in the first place. I just love his response. What do you think about all of this? Do you believe his arguments hold water? Do you like how he laid everything out? Are you shocked to learn about her contractual obligations and how she actually breached them? And what are your thoughts on him accusing her of lying in federal court? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Also, click the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!